Welcome to episode 3 of the Center Clueless podcast. I'm your co-host, Billy Ray Brewton, and with me is your other co-host, Erik Surwill. Erik, howdy.
Billy Ray Brewton, once again, we're here. I am loving this, and thanks again. Obviously, I'm going to keep saying this for the rest of the time I know you. Thank you again for doing this with me. It has been awesome, and I can't wait for the next 50 events like this. So it's going to be great this next year.
Yeah, I concur. And so for folks know, we actually just got finished recording our interview with today's guest, Gina Mallisham. We'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. So we're jacked up. We've had a great conversation. I kind of like this whole recording out of order thing.
Yeah, I think it's good because it gives our guests sort of that early energy, and it warms us up for this, which really is kind of good for me because I realized I felt last time that we did this I needed to warm up for a couple of minutes, but I am actually warmed up and ready to go. One thing I do want to get over, or for old news, was the last time we talked about AI, and I said Butlerian jihad, and then you said but jihad a couple of times in your classic Billy way of making jokes. So in the space of that, I said to Chat GPT, and I picked Chat GPT 4. I said, write a 2-paragraph gay love story in the voice of Frank Herbert Dune series about the butt jihad. And here we go. It's just a couple of sentences or a couple of paragraphs. Here we go. In the distant reaches of the unknown, of the known universe, where interstellar politics and cosmic intrigue intertwined, an unlikely love story unfolded amidst the swirling sands of Arrakis. In the midst of the great butt jihad, a fierce conflict fought over control of the spice-rich desert planet. 2 souls found solace and passion in each other's embrace. They were Jahan, a fearless Fremen warrior, and Zephyr, an enigmatic off-world diplomat. Their love, forbidden by societal norms and the strictures of the rigid patriarchal power structures, blossomed in the shadows of secrecy. In the desolate wastelands of Arrakis, where power was often measured in bloodshed and betrayal, Jahan and Zephyr defied the conventions that sought to bind them. They were warriors in their own right, not just for the people, but for their freedom to love as their hearts desired. Together, they became a force that transcended the bounds of tradition and challenged the status quo. And in their love, they found not only solace, but the strength to reshape the destiny of Arrakis and its people, leaving an indelible mark on the tapestry of the butt jihad and in the annals of love itself. The annals of love.
Oh my God. I love that you took butt jihad and turned it into a poetic movement.
By the way, I tried to do a homoerotic love story and ChatGPT said, nope, we're not doing that. I'm like,
even ChatGPT is fucking
anti-porn. How dare they?
Fucking homophobic and pornphobic. Well, that was lovely. It was nice being taken to the spice mines of Arrakis via the butt jihad. Maybe that needs to become a recurring bit where you just type in nonsense from the previous episode in the Chat GPT.
Well, certainly when you make your nonsense joke, that's what's actually going to happen each and every time because they're generally nonsense sort of pseudo-ish gay jokes, right? Like you're going for the discomfort over here, which you're never going to get. You tried that a lot when we were working together. It's not going to happen. I do not get discomforted with those conversations. It's just not a who cares kind of thing. But it will be a Chat GPT experience because I think it also goes on with the conversation about AI and writers. So that was obviously terrible, and it goes to show you the skill with which that product writes.
Well, this week, I kind of want us to kick off with something that, for me, is a very fun conversation point and something that gives me a lot of joy. And so I have to talk to our listening audience about the multiple count indictment of Anthony Devolder, aka Anthony Zabrowski, aka George Santos, because this gives my heart such joy. And obviously, if you're listening to this, you probably know about George Santos. George Santos is the gay Hispanic Republican who shocked a bunch of people by winning in New York, only to have it immediately discovered that 90% of everything he told during his campaign was bullshit.
Right.
Absolute bullshit. Like, not even small fragments of bullshit, mounds of bullshit. Like, bullshit so strong and so stinky that it would take out, like, a busload of construction workers. Like, just bullshit from top to bottom. Of course, he's been not convicted, but he's been indicted on, I believe, 13 counts.
You hope he's going to be convicted.
Yes, like wire fraud, campaign finance shit, like defrauding the motherfucker had like claimed COVID unemployment benefits when he was making well over $100K a year.
Every scam on the book. Wait, real quick, do you think he's crazy?
I think he's a sociopath.
Right.
I think he's an absolute sociopath, because just listening to the way that he has tried to excuse lying in his campaign, to the point where, like, I mean, it can't be anything other than sociopathy. Like, how do you make an excuse for lying through your teeth through your whole campaign? The only reason you got elected was on lies. But then he's all like, well, my constituents elected me to do a job. Like, no, your constituents elected X, Y, and Z. You're giving them LMNOP. Like, it's a very different thing. And
is it possible he's just had such a sad, and for himself at least, okay, and I'm not judging him, but is it possible he just
judging him like a motherfucker?
Well, sure, judge him, but I mean, is it possible he's just a sad individual that's just being caught in his terrible lies now, and maybe not sociopathy, but maybe just he's completely detached from the reality of who he is as a person, like outside of a psychosis or sociopathy? Is it possible that he's just a sad bullshit artist, like, who's being called out? And really, we're seeing the beginning of a decline into conviction and eventual removal from the Congress.
I am a both and type of person, Erik. I think he can be both a sociopath and what you just described.
Right.
And I think he is despite the fact that he is, his whole appeal was that he is young, he is Hispanic, and he's gay.
Right.
And for the Republican Party, that's a fucking unicorn. Like, and so I understand that the Republican Party was rightfully excited by this guy initially. But I also think he's got a lot of internalized self-hate, self-loathing, and repression that he has not dealt with. And I think when you haven't dealt with these things and your whole appeal to your party are these things, that's a very difficult place to be in. I give respect to that place, because I understand that has to be a difficult place to be in. But that does not give you any license to completely bullshit your way into an office that frankly shouldn't have been his. And also shame on the Republican Party for normalizing that behavior and for saying, not only are we going to still accept, I mean, you heard a few Republicans come out and say, this is unacceptable, he should resign, blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, he was not only accepted, he was put on committees. He was validated every step of the way. And now that he's been indicted, you have people like Kevin McCarthy saying, well, I won't support him for re-election. Like, really? Like, you knew he had done these things earlier. He just hadn't been indicted for them. Like, so I don't know. I find it both heartening and sad, right? Because we're in a position where, it's been normalized that you can just lie your way into office. You can bullshit your way entirely into office. Now,
so real quick, as a question, I'm totally running you over. I apologize.
No, please do.
So there was he won 53.8 to 46.2. Do you think there's enough? I mean, I already know now that there is a huge swing in support for him. He's not gonna get even the nod from the Republicans, at least the voters in his congressional district.
He's done.
He's done. But do you think that that it mattered 6% or 5%? Do you think that if people had learned this beforehand, at least even a trickle of it, do you think he would have won? Probably not, right?
I don't. Based on where he's at, like, based on his district in New York that he's in, I think it makes a huge difference. I think it would have absolutely swung it, because nobody expected him to win that district. Like, that was a surprise. Like, that was it was not expected at all. And so I do think that had a big part in it. And he knows that too. Like, he's known since all this shit came out. He's on borrowed time. He's not getting reelected. Like, he knows this. Like, all he's doing now, all this I can imagine he's doing now is some sort of power play that sets him up for when he's out of office. But no one wants to touch him with a 10-foot pole right now, especially with the idea that, and look, I think a lot of these indictments are probably pretty strong. Yeah, I think there's a good chance he's going to jail.
Well, sure.
And
Yeah, he's gonna at the very least he's gonna face some small amount of jail time and a longer amount of probationary time,
yeah,
and he'll be politically untouchable. I think that also I don't even think he's thinking about the future. I think he wakes up every day and like a shark just keeps moving forward, like many people in politics do. Right? Like they're just I survived another day, and it's just okay, but that's not leadership. That's just survival, which is a poor place to govern from. It's a poor place to live from, I would assert, but here we are.
yeah, and I think if he gets indicted, I mean, I think he absolutely gets removed from Congress. I think the Republicans are just looking for a reason to do it. I think there. I don't think that many Republicans are going to be fighting for George Santos.
Do they have to do another election in that case, or does McCarthy get? I don't know here's my lack of civics
Yeah.
knowledge. Does McCarthy get to replace him, or does it, or how does that work
Well,
in New York?
McCarthy, it would be on a state level how he gets
Right.
replaced,
Oh,
and so yeah, it would definitely be on a state level.
so if it's the governor that gets to replace him, it's going to be a
Well,
Democrat,
I
right?
think there probably has to be. I mean, a lot of states require a special election, and I think New York is probably one of those. I'll do some research on that while in a minute when we're discussing something else. But I think
Sure.
it definitely will be on the state level, whether it's a special election or a
Okay.
governor
Appointed.
appointing.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's gonna be gone, and he should be. I'm sorry. Like I think he is. I think people like George Santos do so much damage to the queer community because he is a unicorn in that sense. I hate calling him anything magical, but like in the extent of like his place
All
in the
right.
Republican Party, that's exactly what he is. And to trade on your queerness like that is so despicable to me.
That's
And to
gross.
and to be actively going against the interests of your own community is so gross to me. And
Right.
not saying that
Selfish.
there aren't. I'm not saying that there aren't queer Republicans. There certainly are, and I'm not certainly not suggesting that they're all trading in on their communities. I don't think they
No.
are,
No.
but he very much was and is.
Yeah.
And I have no respect. I have no care for this person. Like I think they should be gone from the public lens as soon as humanly possible. I think that Congress is already shirking their duties by not removing him. They should have done it the moment they found out that he had lied his way into office. So they compromised their integrity right then and there in not doing that. And they're only compromising it more and more the longer they allow him to stay there and comment
Right.
on these things. Like, how can you have someone commenting on issues that deal with like truth and values and integrity when they themselves have shown to have none?
Right. And you can assume, I think you can fairly and safely assume that anything coming out of his mouth should be suspect. Should be,
Absolutely.
take that shit with a grain of salt because this guy's literally, and when you see his response to people questioning him legitimately, whether it be journalists, other
Oh
politicians,
yeah.
he's so broken and weirdo smug about it. You're like,
Yeah.
dude, come
Yeah.
on. At least eat some of the sandwich. And as you said, and maybe this is an argument for sociopathy. Maybe he's just lost. Maybe he's just a
Yeah.
crazy person.
Well,
And there's nothing to do about it.
I also think he seems to think he's Donald Trump, and I'm sorry, dude. Like, regardless of what you have going for you or not going for you, you don't have the Trump card, like the Trump card, pun
Yeah,
intended.
you're not untouchable like he seemingly is in the
Yeah,
greater
like
party.
Donald Trump can take his sociopathy and he can use it as a weapon that makes him seem like a reformer. Like George
Right.
Santos doesn't have that power. Like his sociopathy comes across as like creepy and weird.
Right.
And
He's the weirdo down the street, not the monster like sort of king, right?
yeah.
That Trump sometimes tries to appear to be, or by the way, is to some of the people that are rabidly following him, right?
And so, this kind of leads into this whole discussion of like candidates for 2024, right? I mean, Trump just had this town hall on CNN that everybody has been just blasting CNN for. How dare they put Trump on their network? Anderson Cooper went on and tried to explain it. People started dunking on him, like questioning his integrity, questioning all of this because they had Donald Trump. And like, I just want to say, and I know a lot of people disagree with me on this front, and that's perfectly fine. But regardless of what we think of Donald Trump, and look, I loathe the man. I think he's a monster, as a lot of people do. he is still the Republican frontrunner for the president of the United States. Regardless of what you think of him, 70 plus million people voted for him in the last election.
Right.
That means 70,
almost half of the voting public.
Yeah. So are you saying that half of the voting public doesn't deserve to have their frontrunner speak on the issues? And my response to that is, regardless of what you think of him, yes, he has been assigned blame for sexual abuse and for defamation of E. Jean Carroll. Yes, we impeached him. Yes, we did all of these things. None of those things disqualify him from being the Republican frontrunner for president. Unfortunately or fortunately, they do not prevent him until he is convicted of a felony. He is still eligible to run for president. And if he is eligible to run and half the fucking country support him, regardless of what we think about that, he deserves the right to speak the same way that any other candidate does. If we don't like what he says, don't fucking listen.
Well, right. And you know, it's this weird, and this is one of the, in fact, this is one of the baselines for this podcast, has been this conversation around, you know, we live in a liberal democracy. Okay. And so in a liberal democracy, there isn't a unitary executive with power. It's shared power, you know, Congress, the courts, and the executive branch. Where we've actually ceded a lot of this is to laws. And what we're going to do is we're going to vote on those laws and then follow those laws. So the legal system itself becomes the unitary power that we all agree upon, because we have some ability to you know, we can elect people who then put laws into place. You know, there's this participation. And what's crazy is, in that type of system, the true power is rhetorical power, or the ability to speak and to leave the people listening, touched, moved, and inspired to follow you. Okay? That's real power. By the time you go back to the law, or even let's just say an executive taking power, which you see a lot with some of the last few American presidents, that's force. And if you're going to force people to do things, it's going to increase the levels of dissonance between the two sides. What you're seeing right now is large voices on both sides of the aisle and throughout arguing for the use of force in imposing their will on the other part of the voting public. And that's not a democracy. That's not the whole space, at least the conceptual reality of America. Obviously, not always the way America shows up. But why would you be arguing for someone not to have a right to speak when, like you said, half the country wants that? Are we just going to disregard them? Are we just going to go ahead and say, hey, I know you're half the voting public, meaning half the public that decides to take the responsibility on to vote. You don't get to talk. We don't even get to platform. I hate that word, but here we go. Platform that guy. And then CNN, like you said, gets shit for it. Meanwhile, I can't remember the lady's name that was in the town hall.
Caitlin Connor or something.
How about this? She absolutely grilled him.
Yeah.
She absolutely grilled him. So, like, come on. I mean, it wasn't like he got on there and by the way, important to Democratic left voters that you got to understand here is Trump going on that town hall saying all sorts of crazy shit isn't good for him. Isn't good for Republicans.
Well, that's the whole thing. Is like, I'm like, who did this hurt? Like, if you went into that town hall and you were a MAGA Republican, all it did was get you hard. All it did was like, he's hitting all of the greatest hits, right?
Right.
If you're a liberal, you probably didn't watch, or you did, and you just got reinvigorated in your hatred for Trump.
Reinvigorated, yeah. You might have lost your shit.
Oh yeah,
and that's fine too.
But if you're an undecided voter, all he did was say everything that you've heard for the past 8 years
that you don't like.
What
and
did
this
he
is why
say?
He wasn't voted back in.
Exactly. What did he say if you're an undecided voter that is going to turn you into a Trump supporter? So, like, who did it hurt? And if anything, I think it benefits Democrats because it just reminds everybody this man is unstable.
Yes.
And
exactly.
so I just don't get this idea that we can't listen to other voices. And I hear all of this stuff like AOC talking about, like, well, all they did was give a sexual abuser a platform to humiliate his abuser. And it's like, okay, like, maybe so, but again, all he did was open himself up for another defamation case.
Right. And
so
all he did was open himself up for losing the election yet again.
Yeah.
Okay, you go ahead and say that same stuff. You go ahead and show the same denial for what we know to be fact, right? That you lost the election. You go ahead and you bring up stuff that is insane. And like you said, open yourself up for another lawsuit. It's just ridiculous. And I think that we are in an age now where you let crazy people talk and let the adults in the room see that and move on to the next thing. That the only thing that you do and serve when you seek to deplatform and suppress speech, and I'm not just talking about the government doing it, I'm talking about anybody doing it, platforms, any of it. You seek to suppress speech. What you do is you play into the hands of those that would ultimately try to remove democracy from America itself. It's ridiculous. The concept of using force and authoritarianism at all to get stuff done in the United States should be anathema to everybody. Is that the right word? Anathema. It should be ridiculous to anybody that considers it. We all have a right as Americans to our vote, and we all have a right as Americans to hear those who are, at least in this case, the leading Republican, candidate. Get out of here with your praise. We shouldn't talk. We shouldn't let him talk. Don't platform him. It's ridiculous.
Well, yeah, and I get all the upset about like the Capitol riots and all that stuff, but like, sorry, yes, he may have been. Yes, he's gone through hearings and all these other things, but like, that's not a conviction. Right. And in this country, regardless, if like, look, we all know O.J. Simpson killed those people. We all know it. OJ knows it. We all know it.
Wait. The glove didn't fit, dude. What are you talking about?
But like, he wasn't convicted. He wasn't convicted. So, no. I mean, Trump hasn't been convicted yet. I have a feeling he'll be convicted on something eventually.
Yeah, the Georgia charges most likely, right?
But like, until then, he's innocent until proven guilty. And yeah, I will defend somebody's innocence until proven guilty that I fucking despise just as much as I will defend it for somebody that I adore.
Well, right, but you're not actually defending them.
No,
you're defending America. You're defending America because America runs on that right and that ability.
Yeah.
So it's just crazy.
But to kind of bounce off of that. So seeing Trump in that town hall, and I did watch that town hall, and it was hard to watch sometimes because he's just peddling bullshit. But what it did make me think of is if Trump ends up debating in Republican primaries, I think he's going to have his work cut out for him this year because this Vivek Ramaswamy, who is also running for president, I think is dangerous. And I think he's dangerous to Trump for a lot of reasons because, yes, he has a lot of the Republican talking points, but they're just slightly spun in a younger, more modern direction, which I think is what makes him dangerous. Because let's be clear, he's 37 years old, handsome, a person of color, also another unicorn in the Republican Party to a degree.
Right.
And whip smart. Like, he gives me Pete Buttigieg vibes. Like, Pete Buttigieg is the Democrat that it doesn't matter who he's debating against. He's got the upper hand because he's just smarter than everyone else in the room.
Right. He's not only smarter, but his intellect and his oratory ability is keyed to debate. Yeah. Right.
And Ramaswamy has a lot of those similar vibes. And I think he would destroy Donald Trump in a debate because
do you think Donald Trump will actually get in the room with him for that? Or are Donald Trump's handlers going to see that?
I think they'll definitely see that. I think it depends on where Trump is in another 6 months, right? Is he in a more vulnerable position where he needs to actually debate, or is he not? Because, people giving Joe Biden shit for not debating, why should he? Incumbents don't usually participate in debates of their own party, and why should Joe Biden want to debate? Like, he's got everything he needs to stand on to want to run for re-election. Like, it's more about Robert Kennedy, or Kennedy should be fucking trying to express why Joe Biden should have to debate. Like, give me that example, because I don't think he needs to. I don't think he has any. There's no argument to be made about why Joe Biden should have to debate.
If Kennedy was a danger to Biden, Biden would debate.
Absolutely. And so
make yourself a danger to him.
But Trump's a different story. Like, people are treating Trump like he's the incumbent. He's not. He lost the last election. Like, he does have some sort of obligation to go out there and express his views because we said in the last election, we don't want it. So you need to tell us why suddenly we want it again. Right. And if he's not willing to participate in the debates, I think it might help him in terms of Actually, I don't want to say that. I don't know if it does help him to not
Right.
debate.
I don't know
I think
either.
there are still a lot, because I think we have this idea, and he is the front runner. It's very clear that he is the front runner. But like, motherfucker had to cancel his rally in Iowa yesterday that they claimed it was for the weather, but people were posting pictures from that thing, and it looked like it was going to be
Empty?
very
Really?
sparsely attended.
Oh, I didn't know
And I'm
that.
like, and
Oh,
I
that's
think
crazy.
we see images from Trump rallies all the time like that, where it's like people. I think the people who are going to vote for him because he's Trump and because of what Trump stands for is a much smaller percentage of the people who are going to vote for him just because he's the Republican nominee. And
Well,
I think,
I'm gonna take a little bit of it. I think that there are people who are pro-Trump because he did get some things done for
sure,
Republicans,
sure,
and also I think a lot of working class Republicans don't like they don't like the I'm going to say the elite political class in Washington. They're just, and because he went to war with that, he
yeah,
gutted the State Department. He gutted parts of USIS and other, like for instance, the part of USIS, and I'm not going to go. We're going to talk about this later, but the parts of USIS that deal with refugee settlement, he just completely emptied them out and left it.
yeah,
And so, because Trump actually went to war against the bureaucratic state, there are a lot of people in the Republican Party that want that done. And by the way, you know, what's his name again? How do you Vivek? How do you say his
Vivek
name? Right?
Ramaswamy.
Vivek, right? He also is promising war against the bureaucratic state, and I think that
Yeah.
I think that is something that is a core Republican value: is to dismantle and destroy the bureaucratic state. And what they see in it is every time they got to deal with a government worker that doesn't do their job right, that doesn't serve them the way that they think they should be served. And I have some agreement here on that, as we will discuss. This is fueling the mess, and Trump absolutely did damage to the bureaucratic state. And I think that that's one of many things that Republican voters want. Just like you said, they're not MAGA, they're not there with the shirt, the hat, but they absolutely are looking at what he did, and they want it done for another 4 years.
Well, and I absolutely, and I want to segue into this conversation that we're going to have, which I think is going to be the biggest chunk of this discussion, which is on sort of the crisis at the border. But
Right.
I want to go into that, sort of talking about this Ramaswamy guy, because one of the things Ramaswamy has a lot of hot takes.
Right.
And he's putting it
Right.
off as like, I'm young, I'm an outside the box thinker. These are my hot takes. And his hot take this week was he wants to raise the voting age to 25.
Right.
So until you're 25, the only way that you would be able to vote is if you enlist, if you are a first responder, or if you take the sort of civics test that immigrants are required to take to become U.S. citizens. He thinks you have to check one of those boxes off in order to be able to vote before you're 25.
Right.
So he's trying to push this as I'm a forward thinker. All this is a very straightforward Republican play. They know that 18 to 25 demographic overwhelmingly votes, Democrat. And so what better thing to do than take away that block of voters so we don't have to worry about them?
I also think they believe that if you involve yourself in many of those things that they discussed that you might do, that it tends to create a lens that votes more conservative. So they're saying not only can you not vote, but here's a path to being able to vote, but through these particular behaviors, which often create a lens that is conservative in value.
Yeah. And so that's that's clearly what that is. Like, that's all they're going for. You can think it's him being progressive and contemporary. It's not. It's just it's the Republican Party trying to save their own ass in perpetuity. And so all they can do at this point is get rid of voting blocks in order to do that. So so the segue that I'm going to jump from that to Republicans trying to suppress votes into the crisis at the border. Because I've been thinking, and we've talked about this, I've been thinking, like, why is the Democratic Party not doing more to address the crisis?
Right.
And then it occurred to me, I started thinking, and then I looked up the numbers, and it was like, it's not in their best interest to do anything about this crisis in a certain way, and this is why. As in the 2020 or the 2022 midterms, 40% of the Hispanic voters voted Republican.
Right.
That was up from 35% in 2020, and that
Right.
was up from 28% just 2 years before that. So
Right.
each election, we're seeing the Hispanic voting population is getting more and more conservative. And part of me wonders, is the Democratic Party not taking as much action on this issue? Because if they take action and they actually start, allowing more and more people into the country the way that they say they want to, those numbers are going to start being even less and less in their favor. And, I hate looking at the Democratic Party that way and thinking that that's the way but all political parties are
All
about
political parties
self-interest.
are like
It's
about
all about
self-interest.
self-interest. And I'm like, that has to be a piece to this puzzle, because I don't know how you just be completely inactive on an issue the way that they have. And so this is a good way into this discussion, I think, about the crisis at the border. And I know you've done a lot more research on this
Yeah.
the last few days. And
I
so
went
I
down the
want you to,
hole.
I
Yeah.
want to hear about the hole that you went down and this idea of, why are we at the place that we are now?
Right. First, let's start there, though, because I think so. Now, I'm going to say some things that I didn't research, and I may be wrong. And please let us know if I'm wrong. But I'm also going to look into it because I didn't realize you were going to say what you said. There's actually a Democratic conversation that happened somewhere, and I can't remember if it was with an organizer or with a pollster, somewhere in their hierarchy, their structure, that talks about new immigrants leaning Democratic, right? And that they could depend on that as time went on. But what's actually happening is as Hispanic families, and by Hispanic, let me be more clear, Mexican, Central American, Nicaraguan, Guatemalan, that space, okay? As people's families are here generation after generation, what you start to see is a turn towards conservatism, because those populations generally lean heavily Catholic, heavily religious, heavily family oriented, which are classic conservative strongholds. And so, I'm just saying, Latinx, that term Latinx, 94% of Hispanics haven't even heard the word, don't even know why someone would use it. So we're looking at a population that, when you come to its core, is generally conservative, in old school conservative values, right? And I think that, so there is that reality. I think that the reality at the border, outside of that, is that the mess at the border is part of the political mess. And what you have is the Republican conservative side, right? Not just Republican, but conservatives in general, including independents, right? And many, by the way, how about this? Maybe many Democrats. You also have the Democrat side, or the progressive side, or the pro-immigration side, right? Which can oftentimes be conservative as well. For instance, there's a small but very pro-immigrant conservative side, which owns businesses which use people who are undocumented. They don't want it to stop. And you're seeing an issue in Florida right now with the greater restriction against the use of people who are undocumented. There are work sites that are at slow down or stopping. Okay. So they're having problems with that. So there's that mixed mess, but generally Republican conservative, generally Democratic and progressive. And the sad truth is where they are primarily battling is in the legal system. Once again, they're using the legal system to try to force change. They're not trying to lead. They're no longer, and I think that that's what's part of it, is I think that people have given up on trying to lead on this issue.
Yeah.
Which is why you see Biden Biden's essentially, he's delegated this to Mayorkas, right?
Yeah.
And who's only now Thursday or Friday starting to say some pretty harsh things about people coming over the border. You get that mess, right? I mean, look, you look at the motivations for those who are undocumented, these migrants. You have the issue of what's called the Northern Triangle, right? Which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. They're coming to the U.S. First off, you have the lack of rule of law. As an example, in Honduras, this is the biggest problem, where block by block, these towns and municipalities in Honduras, they're under the control of gangs at this point. Okay. And that's producing a sort of these are people that generally live subsistence, either it be subsistence farming or doing, certain services. They're not making a lot of money though, right? Like it's not like a big business to sew clothes.
Yeah.
It's just enough to get by. But if you now have to pay a tax on top of your normal tax, now it may make it so that it's a net loss for you. And maybe you own a house in a township somewhere in Honduras, and now you got to pay this tax, and you're actually losing more and more of your savings. Maybe you even had to take a loan out on your house to pay for it. There's one group of people. You have sort of the acute hunger and poverty, mostly in Guatemala, that comes from that climate change driven issues. You had multiple hurricanes. You've had entire, again, subsistence farming as well as actual farming wiped out. You see it in the coffee market. Coffee that used to be $9 or $10 a pound is now $16 to $21 a pound, and that's because a lot of these coffee plantations, these farms have been wiped out, and these people are hungry, and they're trying to. And you'll see a majority male population because a lot of people are leaving their families behind, much like they did in the past, to come work. Lastly, and what really hit everybody is the pandemic. Right. First off, it stopped immigration. Right. Nobody was moving, and so all of those people that have been waiting for the 2 or 3 years, they're coming now. You have. Again, the pandemic destroyed that the mostly subsistence economy. We live in America, and it's like, if you work real hard, you get a little seed money, and you got a great idea, you could probably start a business that makes a little money. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's hard, but I'm saying you could do it. These people with the same level of stick-to-itiveness and work, they're spending it right now on walking, driving, or getting here from Central America, which imagine this. Imagine I said to you, Billy Ray, okay, Billy Ray, I'm going to take away all your money. Now get to Guatemala. Go. I mean, these people are doing the reverse of that. And that, I think that that's commendable, but there is now this mess at the border. You run into this other big mess, which is as the Democrats and the Republicans take over back and forth every 4 to 8 years, right?
Yeah.
What you're getting is the long-term battles are happening in the court. The short-term battles are things like what Trump did through Stephen Miller, right? Douchebag, that he used parts of Title 42, which weren't supposed to be. He shoehorned it in, right? And it was parts of which the various health organizations in the United States government, they didn't want that.
Sure.
Centers for Disease Control didn't want that. That's not even their thing. It's something that Stephen Miller, he shoehorned in so that he could help stop people from getting across the border. So by the way, I support the removal of Title 42. What I don't support is an unfettered migration without a plan from the federal government. It's a federal government program. Or the concept of it's a policy. Excuse me. It's the Biden administration policy. It's unfair for Biden's administration to heap this onto Texas. Is it Brownsville? It's absolutely El Paso. And right now, you got all of this, and then add to the top of it. Lastly, I touched on this earlier, is the government worker thing. Okay. Yeah. In the Border Patrol, you have mostly conservative workers who know how to subvert the system from the inside, and they will. And if you call them on it, they can fall back on that dichotomy, or it's a dichotomy where government workers. Oh, that's right. We didn't talk about this on the podcast. Government workers, if you say, "Hey, you're not doing your job," they could say, "Well, I'm doing all this activity." Whereas you, Billy Ray, at your office, you can't just show activity; you have to show results, right? And that slight imbalance in power allows the conservative elements within Homeland Security, in this case, the Border Patrol, they're going to drag their heels on the stuff they don't want to enforce. On the other side of it, you're going to see people, even people who may be Democrats, they don't like their job, and so they're just going to do it slow or in an incomplete fashion. When you mix all of this up into a big bag of mess, what you end up getting is people who are trapped at the border, who are getting sick, who are they're also they've been sold a bill of goods by the coyotes, right? So they've already spent maybe all the rest of the money they have, and it's on the United States now, whether we like it or not, to take care of this problem. I'm not sure how they're going to do it. I'm not even sure. By the way, the other big question is, why aren't we asking the big questions about climate migration now?
Exactly.
Because we got to start asking those questions. I bet the Democratic side of this doesn't want the hard questions asked because you present America with a question like this. This is something that's only going to get worse, and we have to start taking all these people in.
Yeah.
The first thing in people's minds is going to be, how many is enough?
Yeah.
And by the way,
absolutely.
some people will say no, but go ahead. So you get that's the mess of the border right now, right? It's
yeah. Well, and the climate migration is a big key of it because it's not just our problem. Like you see in Europe, you see all over the world.
Right.
It's not just like all of these folks are just coming to America. Like people from all over the world are going to the closest free societies they can find because of this climate migration issue, which is only going to get worse. And so we're going to see these numbers increase year over year exponentially. And not just for us, but for Europe. And a lot of countries in Europe are dealing with it in very different ways. Some are very accepting and some are being very, very restrictive.
Right.
And I like you, I think we absolutely have to have a fair and humane process to get people who want to migrate into this country to able to do it. But there also have to be limitations on just from an infrastructure standpoint. There's only so many people that we can actually take in.
Right.
And so we have to figure out what that number is, and we on a yearly basis. And I'm sorry, there is going to be a certain point where we just can't take everybody in. Right. I mean, there is going to be that point where we have to turn people away. And, I know there's a whole group of people who think, no, we should have an open door policy. People should be able to come and it will even itself out. It won't even itself out.
No, it never does. Yeah, it never. And what's crazier, by the way, about this is what's appropriate in this governance system in a liberal democracy is we just sit down, we discuss it, we vote on it, and then we move on. But instead, what you're seeing is greater and greater calls on both on the far left. Usually, it's going to be open borders. By the way, there are elements of the far right that believe in that too, but it's a shrinking minority now of the libertarian space. And the reality there is that when you ask them, how is that going to work? Wait a second. How are you going to take in an additional 40 million people? They would say everybody's going to have to just live with less. You're never going to sell that to the American people as a whole. You're not. Yeah. Go ahead and try, but you're never going to sell that. And what the center left, which is currently sort of running things in the Biden administration, they are scared of that question. And of course, on the right, they're just expanding their usual argument, like, who's going to pay for this? I shouldn't have to pay for this. Well, you're stealing my money with taxes. That's now being amped up. The Democrats just want unfettered open borders so they can bring in people that'll vote for them, give them a bunch of stuff for free, and then go ahead and destroy this country. I mean, that's the bullshit on the right.
But what the Republicans are doing, though, is a lot smarter than what we're doing in a large degree, because their talking points right now are, we have to fix the border crisis. It doesn't need to be an open border. We want people to have a path to citizenship, but it needs to be X, Y, and Z. They're appealing to that group of Hispanic voters who are already here, who went through the process. Because let me tell you, knowing some of those people, they are some of the strictest against the idea of like people just being able to, because they had to go through a process. They had to put money and time into it. Now they are U.S. citizens. They feel protective over that. They don't want open borders. They don't want people to be able to just sneak across the border and become, they want them to go through that exact same process.
If you talk to a family, a good example is I know there's a family, I know they're Mexican, and they all came outside of amnesty and outside of illegal. They came legally. Yeah. And they are the most conservative group of people that I know. And they are absolutely not. They don't want anything to do with that. And so it is, and as we discussed, generation after generation, Mexican, Guatemalan, Honduran, the entire Central American space gets more conservative year over year. It just does. And I think that's another. To be honest, I'm going to be interested in seeing what happens, because while they're conservative, they aren't necessarily MAGA conservative. Yeah. So hopefully what this means is a calming of the sort of crazy stuff that you might hear on the right. But maybe I'm just being a Pollyanna.
Well,
I don't know.
I just wonder, if you're a Hispanic person and you have been stuck at the border for however long now, months, years, you're not being allowed in this country. You're not even being given, if you're that person and you finally get into this country, who are you going to take out those frustrations on? Probably the president who's in office
Right.
and who's been keeping you there.
Right.
And that's Joe Biden. So like
Right
these
now,
people, who all they're hearing are like Ted Cruz down at the border with a megaphone talking about how sorry he is for what they're going through and how we need to fix the issue. Like, Democrats aren't down there doing that. And
Nope.
I don't think the Republicans believe it. I think it's
Nope.
all performative, but they're the ones down there doing it. They're the ones down there appealing to Hispanic voters. They're
Right.
the ones down there saying, we're the only party that cares about this issue and is going to be able to do something about it. And I think it's working. I think that argument is working.
It is.
And, Joe Biden, I think he still has time to address this issue, but he's kind of run out. Like, Title 42 has expired. He had time to work something out before it expired. He chose not to do that. And, and like you said, like, this is not a state issue. Like, because let's be clear, the boundaries, the borders of the United States take precedent over the borders of the individual states. So while this may be the Texas border, it is more so than that, the United States border. And we have the United States has the obligation to fix that issue, like you said, not the state of Texas.
Right.
And Texas is already a state. Yes, it is a red state, but it is a red state that we have seen over the last 2 or 3 election cycles start drifting bluer and bluer and bluer. And that's because you have a lot of these young folks who are moving to Texas, who are moving to the big cities, to Austin, to Houston, to places like this. And like, what does that do for that movement? Like, what does that do for that slowly turning purple movement when you've got this issue on the border that Democrats aren't addressing, but Republicans are?
Right. Not only not addressing, but avoiding. And here's the thing. What the problem for the Democratic Party as a whole, but specifically for Biden himself, is this: either Biden's going to lead on this issue or Biden will be led by the voters in a couple of years here. And that's going to be, like you discussed, terrible for the overall space.
Yeah.
Like the Republicans, look, Cruz, I'm not sure he's being authentic, but what if he is? What if this is Cruz? What if this is Cruz's breaking point for him to say something that's authentic? What's going to happen?
Yeah.
It means it's going to be a space where he's going to now lead on this in a space that's been classically democratically led.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do with that? It is going to be a mess for the Democratic Party if they don't get out in front of it, start authentically leading. And I mean leading by having conversations that leave people with a concept that they know what they're going to do and they trust them. And hey, let's give them some more time to get it done.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we're setting ourselves up in a bad way for the next couple of election cycles with Hispanic voters. I don't know if that's enough to like tip the edge over in favor of the Republicans. I'm not even going to get into that, but it's a problem, right? It's a problem regardless, because what if Democrats historically had, right? We know we can count on the black vote generally.
Right.
We know we can count on the queer vote pretty broadly.
Right.
We have always also been able to count on the Hispanic vote.
Less so.
At least a majority, but less so, but a majority of the Hispanic vote. And that majority is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking every election cycle.
By the way, as is the Asian vote now, through the conversations around education and other things that have been going on. It's now the Asian vote is starting to shrink incredibly. But
it's not that these voters are pro-Republican. They're just anti-Democrat.
Right. And that's exactly right.
Yeah, they're not pro-Republican. They're anti-Democrat. They fall somewhere in the middle. They fall into that group of undecided voters in a lot of election cycles. And that's why that base has grown so much. And that's why you see someone like Kennedy doing far better in the polls than you would expect someone like Kennedy to be doing. It's not because he's like some great fucking politician that everybody is just, he hasn't like moved and inspired people. It's just because he's an alternative. Right?
Like some alternative, some possible alternative to this mess. Yeah.
And he can claim to be a Democrat. He's far more, I feel like, libertarian than he is Democrat in a lot of his views. But yeah, I mean, like, and that's what I see happening. And it's concerning. Like when the margins are so small, and like every election going forward is going to be very small margins. I think we can see that going forward. It's not going to be blowouts heading into any foreseeable election. With the margin so small, every fucking vote counts.
Yes.
Every voting block counts. And Republicans seem to be identifying that, frankly, better than Democrats. And I don't know what that means. I still think the Republican Party is in a crisis of conscience, and I think the overall look of the Republican Party 5 years from now is going to be very different than what it is now. But Republicans have generally always found a way to outmaneuver Democrats. And I see them doing that. And it's frustrating because it's not that we don't identify the issue. It's just not important enough for us to act on it.
Right. We think if we first we have our morals, and if we're morally correct, we will win. That kind of attitude is broken because don't look now. Everybody may not share your point of view, and it's not good enough to be angry or scared of Donald Trump. And how about this? The second Donald Trump passes away, the Democratic Party is going to lose their ass if they don't watch out. They're going to lose their ass.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, we all have a collective boogeyman right now.
Right.
We have this one person who is our collective boogeyman. He represents all the things that Democrats loathe about the Republican Party.
Right.
Everything that they've always loathed, he has accentuated. Like he's turned it up to 11.
Right. Everything that independents loathe, which is key.
Yeah.
You put he goes away and they put up someone, in this case, DeSantis. If they were able to put up DeSantis, I assert Biden would be in trouble right now.
I think so too. I think if something happens to Donald Trump, whether it is health or indictment or like he's in jail or whatever, if something happens there and someone like a DeSantis, even though I think DeSantis is kind of done at this point.
Sure.
And look, I'm the one who I've said many times that I thought he had a shot. I take it back. I was wrong. I think he has proven himself to be pretty ineffectual.
Right.
But Ramaswamy is not ineffectual. And there might even be more contenders by that point. Like if Trump were to be a non-factor, Democrats have a problem. Because while someone new is not going to incite the Republican base the way Trump did, they are going to appeal to those middle of the road voters and those undecided voters in a way that Trump couldn't. And that's dangerous. Right. Because there are no far right MAGA people who are going to vote for a liberal over a Republican, regardless of who it is. But there are
Nikki Haley is another
there
example.
Are middle of the road voters.
Yeah.
But there are middle of the road voters who will absolutely vote for a Republican who is not Donald Trump.
Right. And they would vote for Ramaswamy, they would vote for Nikki Haley, they would vote for a lot of people.
Or even a middle of the road Democrat. And I know that we say that Biden is that, but he is a centrist, but he still espouses very leftist views in a lot of ways that Republicans are just not on board with.
He's playing the piano. Yeah.
But like you look at somebody like a Pete Buttigieg, who is by all classifications a centrist. Like he's tried to play up this liberal side of him, but he is very much a centrist.
Yeah, but honestly, with the Democratic base, do you think he would ever make inroads with the black community? Because he's actually performed terribly in the black community.
He certainly has. I think the proof is in the pudding, though, right? Like what work can he show that he's done as transportation secretary,
right,
that actually works for and benefits the black community? Like, does he have arguments to make? And so I agree with you. I think it's been on him to show why he should matter to the black community. I don't know that he's successfully done that either. I do think we're going to see another Pete Buttigieg presidential run at some point for sure. And I'm in favor of that entirely. I think he would be a really good candidate. But I use Pete Buttigieg sort of in that middle of the road space where I think whether you're Republican or Democrat, there is space for someone to pick up those votes. But like I said, we could talk about these issues for 6 hours. We don't want the podcast to be that long, but excellent discussion though. I think I certainly learned some new stuff, which is always what's most exciting to me about this podcast.
Right. This is actually another great one. I am having the time of my life, boss. I really appreciate doing this with you. It forces me to be frank with you because I have to sit down and research the shit coming out of my mouth.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to come on here and be some asshole, although I am. It not only allows me to understand better already, but again, it sort of gives me a space to not rant to my poor friends who used to have to hear my political rants outside of this podcast. Now I could just, it's on the podcast. I did research. You don't have to listen to me at any other time of the week. It's perfect.
Thanks everybody for listening so far. There's still plenty more to come. So if you stick around, you can take a listen to our interview with Gina Mallisham, who is the executive director of the Jefferson County Memorial Project. We have a fantastic discussion about a whole host of issues.
Yeah, she was awesome. She was awesome.
Yeah,
So
Gina
good.
was incredible, and I think you're going to really enjoy that conversation. So we'll get to that after a brief word from our sponsor, so stick around, and we'll see you soon. Our guest today is Gina Mallisham, the former marketing director of Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and current executive director of the Jefferson County Memorial Project, a grassroots coalition that memorializes victims of racial terror violence and expands our county's understanding of past and present issues of racial injustice. That county is Jefferson County, Alabama, which is where I met Gina quite a few years ago at Birmingham Shout, our lovely queer film festival there.
Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
You as well. No, we're so glad to have you on here, and we've got a lot to talk about. What is it they say? We're going to cut the pleasantries and get right to it. No, not really.
Right.
Talk a little bit about, you're currently executive director of Jefferson County Memorial Project. So this is an organization that is committed to making sure that, these names that we see written all over our buildings and streets aren't forgotten. And you're doing it in what many consider to be sort of the epicenter of the civil rights movement. I'm curious, how does Birmingham's history make it or that Jefferson County's history, how does it make it the opportune location for this kind of work?
Well, Jefferson County is the perfect place to begin work like what we're doing. But I have to correct you in noting that it's not the names on the streets that we, while we are memorializing those folks as well, it's the unknown names of the victims of racial terror lynchings that JCMP really focuses their work on. So we were founded when the Equal Justice Initiative opened their National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery. And so what folks can see there is over 800 giant metal Corten plaques engraved with the names of documented victims of racial terror lynchings, all the way up until the end of 1979. And so what the EJI did was they charged over 800 counties with doing the work of unpacking our past, reckoning with it, and helping our counties understand it and how those crimes still affect us today. And then once that really great work is done, each county would then receive their marker, their replica marker from the EJI. So that's how JCMP was born. But I will say that now, almost 5 years into this citywide coalition, we're doing a lot more work than that.
Wow. Yeah. So you're focusing on, look, as the Jordan Neely killing just taught us, it seems like every week there are more and more names to unfortunately add to this kind of work. And I wish I could say it seems like it's getting that much better, but it's really not. And when we talk about racial violence and terror, obviously we can track that all the way back to slavery. I'm curious. This is an issue that we wanted to discuss that we've been talking about for behind the scenes for a while. And I'm curious for your perspective on this, not only obviously as a Black person, but also as someone who is working in that space. Let's talk reparations for a minute, right? Let's talk about this idea of reparations that we hear talked about a lot. And you hear the left, it gets brought up as a talking point by the left a lot, though. Unfortunately, I feel like it is just a talking point for the left. They don't really seem like they actually want to take action on it. And then, of course, Republicans don't even think racism exists anymore. So, they don't think it's even anything we should consider. I'm curious, what is your opinion on the idea of reparations? And is that something that we should be moving towards as a society?
Most definitely. Yeah, we should definitely be moving that way. But I think that just like with the idea of defunding the police, when people speak on the notion, it's really important that they understand what's actually possible and what they're suggesting would actually mean. So obviously defunding the police would be the scariest thing to happen in this country. If folks couldn't call 911 in an emergency, where would we be, right? And so when I think about reparations, I don't envision a check that comes in the mail or is directly deposited into your checking account with some very difficult to determine number, honestly, no matter what type of historians and researchers we have doing the work. And then I also think about the economic impact of paying those teams to figure out what those numbers should be. But I do agree with the idea of reparations. Other countries have done it successfully. I just think it needs to look a little different, because what racial injustice looks like today is very different, right? And so we can all agree that there are systems that need to change. Systems of change is what will bring us the reparations that I believe minority Americans deserve. But I think it looks like our highway administration, the Federal Highway Administration, has a program called Reconnecting Communities. It has been researched and determined and reckoned with and agreed upon that our interstate system further applied the disparages of redlining in our communities. Yeah. And so increasing access from one side to the other within communities, in areas where highways have ripped out homes, that's a form of reparations. At the same time, our National Park Service is doing something similar to increase access to our national parks for what we historically have called underserved communities, is now being referred to as access communities. But I consider that to be a form of reparations. And I think that we've been on a really good path for like the last 20 years towards some of these systematic changes that will increase equity. But I don't think that it looks like sending me or my mom a check in the mail.
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting take. And I also, the idea of reparations too, it seems like, I don't know, it seems like people every few years there's a different reason why we shouldn't do it, right? And it used to be, well, it would just be too mammoth of a project to undertake. Yeah. But I think if COVID taught us nothing else, it's that, a government response, like the idea of like mailing checks to every single, like we kind of did that in the COVID response. Yes, there were bumps, and yes, it wasn't smooth across the board, but that was actually, I think, a good first step into showing that a widespread governmental response like that is possible. Erik, so I'm curious, because we have only talked about this, sort of off mic more than anything, but what is your perspective on that? Let me get you into the conversation here.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is when we talk about checks to each individual person, say, and again, I think that it would be absolutely, in my opinion, directed towards the descendants of American slavery, right? The people who have truly been impacted by sort of the horror, not only the horrors of slavery, but by the continued, and it was systemic, right? But cultural restrictions, the cultural repression of Black Americans. Yeah. But like you said, while maybe a check to each person wouldn't work, and in fact, if you did something like $50,000 per individual, you're talking about trillions of dollars. But let's say, or at least hundreds and hundreds of billions, or billions, if not trillions. But let's say instead of a check, let's say that we were to create in America a bank that was like the first American Black bank, with each Black individual that's a descendant being a shareholder of that bank. This would allow over time Blacks to take advantage of that systemic advantage of owning stock, of owning part of a big deal. And let's be clear, the first the first Black American bank, there'd be a lot of people that would want to put their money there to support the Black community. That's just like one example. Obviously, it's just an example. But I think there are a lot of ways for reparations to be applied. And then the second thing is, it can't just be one generation. You probably have to do it for 2 or 3 generations of Black Americans for it to make a long-term difference, that vested ownership, for instance, in, say, a bank. Imagine you did it for 3 generations, $50,000 vestment. At the end of that, you would probably have quite a powerful financial force that could also, by the way, prioritize the loaning of money to Black businesses, to Black individuals for college. There's a lot of ways that you could use that financial system as it exists. But when you see, look, and I will be negative here, when I see people talk about $1 or $2 million to every Black American, you're talking about more money that exists on the entire planet. And it doesn't sound like something that's ever going to happen. And why you have some leaders advancing that conversation, it really trivializes the whole thing. And so I think that the reparations have to be generational, they have to be effective, and they have to leave Black Americans with the same ownership equity over the same types of institutions that, well, I have, having been here, some people in my family since 1800. So.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. I've certainly never heard of the idea of, a small seed of money growing over time, but I can only imagine how long it would take for it to, in terms of actual equal reparations, it would take 400 years plus because that's how long things have been unequal.
I really do think that generational. Here's the thing. You're absolutely right that it will take generations for Black Americans to get true reparations from this long-term and in many ways systemic repression of the Black culture, the Black community, and Black financial health and wealth. So I think that it's going to be something that takes at least 100 years to give people the step up that would allow Black Americans to at least have some parity in the financial markets over time. It's going to take a drastic act like that, but it's also going to have to be something that can be afforded at the time. Like if there's enough, if we had to put out $2 trillion every, say, 25 years, and then, of course, larger amounts as time went on, what you would have is these infusions over time would, again, raise the Black community up, especially if it's put into, again, like a bank or financial systems that could then also use its clout and its power to further enhance and bring up that community from the space that they're in now, which is, you look at what Black Americans own between, I can't remember the exact numbers, so someone may come at me with this. It's between 5 and 10% of I think it's like 2 to 5% of the total wealth when they're 13 to 15% of the population. And that's broken, right?
Right. Not to mention their ancestors, did most of the work to create said wealth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
but I applaud that idea, Erik. I really do, of the idea of making money grow for the Black community. If we don't start today, when would we start? The longer it would take us to start, the longer it would take it to grow.
Yeah, it's a long fix, but we got to get to work, or it's just going to be the same conversation, the same, sort of injustice of it, right? That continues on to this day.
Yeah.
Well, on that idea of sort of ancestry, I'm kind of curious, Gina, because the main talking points I hear now from like a lot of people, I'm thinking of folks like Bill Maher, Pierce Morgan, like these big sort of like what purport to be liberal voices are always like, well, why is this something that I have to worry about? It wasn't me. It was my ancestors. How does that affect me? What is your response to someone like that who thinks that just because it's not something that we feel like we were actively involved in, that it's not our responsibility?
Right. I mean, I immediately think whenever I hear that is that if I asked you right now if you believe that racism and systems that disparage folks based on their race still exist, that same individual would say yes. Undeniably, I'm not going to be crazy enough to say that racism still exists. And so in that same sentiment, you have to realize that if it still exists, then you still have something to do with it. Every single one of us does. No one is not affected by it. And if we're doing nothing, then we're perpetrators, or at the very least, co-conspirators, for those systems that still exist. And in the same breath, the folks that say, well, this is a thing of the past, it's nothing to do with my generation, me, my friends, my family, we believe in equality and we're not racist. We have to then remind them that they're allies. If they're doing nothing, they're not. But if they're allies to these disparaged communities that they care so much about, then they would join the coalitions that are reaching out to them, and they would support the idea of teaching our true history so that we don't repeat it. Because, yeah, that is true what you say. There's a lot of folks, particularly, media pundits who say, I'm not racist, but my ancestors might have been, but that's not me. And no one is actually saying that it's them. What we are saying, though, is that things are still unfair and they're still leaning in the same directions of benefit. And so if you really want to see equality in your lifetime, then you have to stop thinking with this. I honestly think it's an indifference, and start thinking, more with more action and engagement to the political process behind it.
Sorry, Billy. I'm glad that you said that. I'm going to add one other thing to it is that I know because I know how I feel when I hear some of it, right? I know that I don't want to hear that I'm at fault. And to be fair, I'm going to be honest, I don't think that I'm at fault at all. I don't think I'm at fault. I think it's ridiculous. I had Kleagles and the Ku Klux Klan 5 generations back that are in my family. It was one of the holes I sort of fell into is reviewing that in preparation for this podcast. But I'll tell you this, there is one entity that exists today that still has a legal, moral sort of culpability in this, and that's the United States itself. It's still the same United States. It's still the same entity. And it is up to the United States as an entity to care for this and take care of this. And whether we like it or not, right? Like, again, I'm not going to be teaching my daughter that she's responsible for racism or that she's responsible for slavery. But I absolutely need to teach my daughter that this is something that happened. By the way, one of the things I love about your organization is that you're erecting historical markers to this. I need my daughter to see that because let's be honest, the real history of it, while there's more things being discovered, every family like my own who's had family here for generations has stories and has leftovers of history that are slowly being destroyed. Each new person that passes away, all of the documents that they may have are being thrown out. A lot of people aren't interested in reading letters that show that their families were racist in the past, and they throw those away. I know because I've seen it happen in my own family. I have a letter from my great-grandfather to my grandmother saying that you've been a problem to us since you brought that black boy home when you were 17, right? And so in that space, even though he had left Indiana, in 1919, because him and my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, they were troubled by the racial violence that was going on. And let's be honest, in Indiana, in 1919, there were 300,000 KKK members. Almost every white man of majority age, over 18, was in the KKK.
Right.
And so, of course, they put it out there that they left because they were above that, but the reality was it was really a classist attack against our own family, right? These are the dirt farmers, and we're not those dirt farmers. Meanwhile, he would then turn to my grandmother and say that to her because at 17 she went and had a soda with a black man in LA, and it became a mess for them. There's all of that that's going to be gone if we don't not only get into. It's not just about reparations, getting money to people. It's also about, I think, allowing the actual history that is in all of these white families as well to be expressed, to be documented, and to be out there for people to see as well, so that we can't live in this fantasy land of it's all equal and perfect now, we're done, right? I think it's crazy.
Right.
Well, also, I mean, I disagree a little bit. But, I get where Eric's coming from. I think in terms of whether or not, if I consider it my responsibility, right? I kind of look at it this way, and this is the best way that whenever I've had this conversation with other people that I've been able to put it, which is no one has a problem when their family members pass down good stuff, right? When they leave you their car, or their house, or their bank account, or their land. We're tickled pink when we get that. If we're going to be so accepting of the good stuff, we have to be accepting of the bad as well. And so if we're going to accept all the good things that our ancestors gave us, we also have to accept that they also gave us some bad things, and those bad things are ours just as much as the good things. And so I feel like,
exactly right.
And I feel like we have to own that, and we have to accept that. We may not like it. And I know there are a lot of people out there who will not like it, but I don't look at it that way. I look at it as, I feel like I am responsible for my relative. I can trace back my relatives all the way back to like the Mayflower. Like I can trace them a long way back. And I do feel a certain amount of responsibility for what they did. And
Yeah.
not everybody feels that way. I am someone who does and I look at it this way. I mean, Black history is white history. I mean,
It's American
yeah,
history.
it's American
Yeah.
history. Like
Right.
the history of white people in this country is totally different without the presence of Black people throughout that history. And, we
Yeah.
can't escape that. We can't pretend that isn't intertwined in a really substantive way. And,
Right.
I love your suggestion, Erik. Like, I think the idea that you were discussing about, the bank and like this sort of long-term setting up for success, I had never heard it put that way either. I think that's actually kind of a really interesting idea for that. But I do think we have a certain level of culpability in it. Yeah, that's my soapbox.
No, I don't disagree. Go ahead. Sorry, Gina. Please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think one thing that we really need to, focus on in terms of what we can do today, because that's what we're asking folks, is for their allyship,
Right.
to assist in making these necessary changes for the material conditions of Black people in America. And the first thing that we look at is that systems have to change, and no systems can change without proper research and dedication to what those changes should be. And if we are trying to bring justice for the more than 30 million descendants of American slavery, that research is key. And we are living in a time now where not only the research, but the teaching of the findings is being criminalized.
Yeah.
We've got an entire political party passing on the false notion that critical race theory, which obviously only exists in law schools and has only ever existed in law schools, is something that's being taught to their children, very young children, which is untrue. But the more that we learn, the more that we find, the more we realize that we have to begin these changes, these cultural and societal changes early on, even if it's the small notion of equity, equality, empathy, self-empathy for young people. And so we have, a main political party in our country that is saying that's not okay. You can't teach this history. But without learning it, we can't affect any change or even suggest any change for the systems that perpetuate the inequalities today. And to your point, Billy Ray, there were enough systems in place to prevent Black folk from reading, from writing, from holding on to their culture, so that we can't trace our lineage in the way that you can trace yours, even with the advances of technology today. And so Black genealogy research is a major effort that folks can support if they want to help, to bring equality. Because without that genealogical record, you really don't know where you came from, who you came from, what tribe in Africa, what coast you landed on, let alone who owned your ancestors 2, 3, 400 years ago. I think that in terms of preserving our history, the way that it is today is not going to benefit Erik's children. I think Erik's children are benefited by preserving the true history that we're well on our way to discovering together, if we could just stop folks from making it illegal.
Yeah. And, I grew up in a really rural small town in Alabama. And I guarantee you now they don't teach this. But when I was in school, it was mandatory that we took an Alabama history course. And that Alabama history course was very unyielding in its descriptions of sort of the horrors of racial injustice in the state of Alabama. Like, we got an education in that. Like, it went in depth on all of that stuff. Like, I learned, we learned about all of these leaders. We learned about, obviously Martin Luther King Jr. and Medgar Evers and folks like that. And that was in a very rural, small part of Alabama. And, the county that I grew up in, we had a 0% non-white population when I was a kid. 0%. It was all white people as far as the eye can see. You had to drive 45 minutes to an hour to see any face that wasn't white. And so if I hadn't have had that education in middle school and high school, like, who knows where I would be right now. And sure, there are a lot of kids in my class who got that same education, and they're probably despicable racists right now. I mean, that's just the truth. But I certainly know for me, getting that education at a young age was really important. And the fact that we don't have that now, and we have a conversation that I say that we're having on this podcast. This is our third episode. It's not like we've been going on for years, but you're going to hear me talk a lot about civics in classrooms and how I'm trying to draw a direct link between sort of the erosion of democracy and the elimination of civics education in schools. Yeah. I think civics,
and you won't have a hard time.
And I think civics should include, because if you're going to talk about democracy, you have to talk about the good and the bad. I think part of that civics education has to be a very in-depth discussion of not just how democracy looks on paper, but how it is looked for people of different races as well. Like democracy for white people has been very different than democracy for black people. And I think we have to work that into that civics education.
Yeah. Diversity education terrifies folks because, and the chief complaint that we hear from residents and our legislators here in Alabama is that it makes their children uncomfortable. And we have no right to make their children feel uncomfortable in a place so important as the school. But diversity education is not any more uncomfortable than math for me, honestly. There is no growth without a little bit of pain, and no one's ever denied that. But that's the very light house that they're standing on is that, and it's built of straw, and no matter how often we blow it over, it gets built back up again. We keep coming back to these points of making people feel uncomfortable and how it's just absolutely not okay. But we'll keep pushing for diversity education. I'm happy to know that that's a crucial issue to you, Billy Ray, which makes sense considering we shared, queer media with a population that did not have access to it, simply because we can't imagine anyone else in any other space having done it. And so the same thing, rings true for that civics education, for that history education, even in art and literature. Things are so skewed that kids don't have access to a lot until they're adults. I was having a conversation with someone. I was speaking to a lunch group here in Mountain Brook, Alabama. And someone told me and this is a 60-year-old man, told me that it wasn't until he was 54 that he knew the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed. Right. And I think that speaks to his proximity, being born and raised here in Birmingham. It's because, his wife is from another region and she knew. So, when she came here, she wanted to take that civil rights pilgrimage. And, she saw things that she had heard of before, but that he hadn't. And so I say all that to say, I think that part of the reason why you were able to get such an equitable education with so much history included is because of your distance and you're from however many other Black residents might have lived near you, right? And so when the room is diverse, these conversations are a little harder. When it's not, they can go on for a really long time. People discover things about themselves when they're in an entirely white space or an entirely Black space. But once you mix the spaces, that's when we really do have people get so uncomfortable that they are completely unwilling to participate. So you and I, Billy Ray, are at the advantage for having been a little older. Yeah. We got a different Alabama education than kids are getting today. And that they'll even get tomorrow if we allow our legislators to continue erasing parts of our history.
Well, I just want to say very quickly, Erik, and then I want to hear from you, which is because this just struck me when you said this. And people are talking about they don't want to teach these things because it makes kids uncomfortable. Well, I'm curious, what makes kids more uncomfortable? Learning about, say, Medgar Evers and how he was assassinated, or having to do an active shooter drill?
Right.
No, what makes kids more uncomfortable? I would argue the latter. Period. So why don't we? So Erik, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off there.
And I'm sorry, but I think that I wanted to bring some level of distinction to what this one conversation about the discomfort of white children, right? And what's interesting is when I was younger, so when I'm 53 now, so I was going through school in the 70s, and my school did the Jane Elliott exercise involving eye color, right? Where they They divide the entire
Yeah.
school into brown-eyed kids and blue or green-eyed kids, and then you, for a day, you act, that you allow whatever's going to happen. And what you end up having is a lot of angry blue and green-eyed kids who were feeling put upon, and I was talking trash by the end of it. I can remember it clearly as a 7-year-old child. That same year, when Roots, there's a movie, a TV show called Roots that came out. They played that at my school, right? And there was a
Wow.
conversation about it. I went to a very liberal private school that my mom worked 2 and 3 jobs to keep me in as a single mom in 1977. And I got that education. But, what's crazy and what I think is dishonest about the whole discomfort conversation is there are some educations that I would never allow someone to say to my daughter. Any conversation that's going to say, because of your skin color, you are this, I'm never going to allow it. However, if they were to say to me, we want to do the Jane Elliott test, or the days that particular program, I would have her do that. In addition, and what I think is really important is that once you establish for them that discrimination exists, and this is what it looks like, all you have to do at that point is teach them true history. And if they're uncomfortable from that real history, that's inside of them, right? You're not saying, look at all this stuff that you did. You're saying, look at all this stuff done to these people. And to be fair, what you see the right wing doing is taking that very small percentage, I'd say less than 1 or 2% of diversity trainings out there that I would absolutely disagree with, right? The concept of white guilt, I think it's ridiculous. However, this is what happened. And don't look now, it was your culture at an earlier time that engaged in it. Now, what are you going to do about it? That's, I think, a much more powerful question to ask of children. And the discomfort from that, I, as a father, would be like, well, what are you going to do about it? That I could get behind. If someone wants to go in and say, 1, 2, 3, here's a list of things why white people are bad, I don't want to hear about it. So I think that what's sad is that maybe what was a legitimate concern on the part of some white parents towards some very small amount of diversity trainings has now been turned into this ogre on the conservative white side, the conservative right side. And I think it's completely dishonest discussion. Children have to be discomforted in school. That's part of the design of schooling, is for them to get out of their comfort zone. And if you spend your entire time making kids comfortable, what you get are people in their mid-20s, maybe into their mid-30s, that don't know how to deal with strife, or they don't know how to deal with loss, they don't know how to deal with failure, so
Yeah. And they end up strangling people to death on New York City subways.
Right.
Yeah.
Or right. Because there's this culture of fear. The same thing happened with Bernie Goetz, right? I mean, he was actually, to be clear, Bernie Goetz was absolutely, at the time, he was absolutely attacked. But when he, and I'm going to air quotes this, took power, he became a monster, right? His last comment to the last young man that he shot was, "Hey, you want another?" Bam. Shot him again. I mean, so at that point, we're now using previous stuff as a justification to now re-offend in an old school American cultural way. It's just terrible.
Yeah. And here we are 38 years later, trying to reconcile with the same understandings. Like, I can completely understand being afraid. I've had the fortune of getting some trauma-informed training in the work that I've done in my life. Most people haven't. And we rely on our police officers to have that sort of training, but there were no police officers present on that New York City subway. So it's a matter of who's been failed here. And a lot of folks who honestly I can't quite disagree with, the popular opinion anyway is that New York City failed Jordan Neely and the other riders on the subway, more so than anything, because civil society can't exist when the law of rule fails. And that's meant to include our streets and our public transit systems. And the rule of law has to apply to the most and the least powerful citizens. And Jordan was a member of the community who had already sought services, social services in a lot of different areas, and had been failed by the system before he was killed. So I don't know about the 4 young men on the subway in 1984, but I think immediately to the fact that our community could be more trauma informed, and that is going to be uncomfortable. That's going to be an uncomfortable process. It was uncomfortable for me because we don't like to believe that we have bias, or that we live in bias, but we all do. It's a natural human experience, and usually something that comes, just along with disgust to keep us safe. But at the same time, it can be a harm to others. And so when I think to the things that I've learned in diversity trainings and the conversations that I've had about DEI over the last couple of years with professionals who do this work, is that it's often a performative change that agencies, organizations, schools, institutions make because that is the woke thing to do. That's the right thing to do. But they don't really know what they're teaching, and they rarely find someone who is actually a specialist to teach it. So it's really easy to make someone feel uncomfortable. I guess that would be the same as me going to a mechanic for a pap smear. He's not going to know how to do it right. It's going to be really uncomfortable. And so just as important as it is for us to have diversity education, the educators need to be ready as well to have those conversations with kids.
Yeah, and I want to use this to kind of segue into the next topic, but I want to say, so we do, I run a very progressive queer film nonprofit here in Seattle, which Seattle is one of the most progressive cities in the country, if not the most progressive city, frankly. And so, we do DEI training every year. And one of the things and I've actually learned a lot from it because I went in with a very open mind, and I went in with I know that I have biases. I know I do. I can't consciously name most of them, but I know they're there. And so we were having this conversation. We were and this was pretty far into the DEI training because they generally don't want to start a DEI training by being like, okay, how are you racist? right? So you work into that. And so
those people don't even know.
Yeah. And so we got into there and we were having a conversation, and she was asking, an incredible instructor, by the way. And she was but in a very she was like, so what are some ways that we can identify biases in ourselves? And I was sitting there and I just really can't think of any. And I wasn't able to give an answer that session, but we continued until the next one. That night I went to the movies. And I was sitting in the movie theater and I was getting ready and I wasn't even thinking about it. And this group of younger, probably in their 20s, maybe early 30s, of these Black friends walked in, and they came over and they sat near me, and I caught myself going oh God. And then it hit me. I was like, oh crap. There's one right there. You just naturally assume if there's a group of young Black friends coming into a theater that they're going to talk through the movie. And I know this is such a minor microcosm of but it's for me, it was holy shit, there's one right there. And then
that's absolutely something that is in the white community as large. It's the Black people here, they're going to talk loud in the theater. Exactly. That's absolutely a trope.
And I caught myself in that moment. It was oh, there we go. And it was kind of like a light bulb. It was okay, well, now let's dive deep and find out where more of these instances exist, because now I know they're there and it wasn't registering to me. And so, I try to be conscious of that all the time. And I'm very clear with folks I like being called out on that shit. I like calling myself out on that shit because look, what are we, we all just survived a pandemic. What is there to do except try to make ourselves the best versions of ourselves at this point?
Yes.
And so I want to use that as sort of a segue here because, I do want to talk to you a little bit, Gina, because, you're also a, vocal member of the queer community. And so I kind of want to talk about because, we were doing work for the Queer Film Festival in Birmingham back, I started doing that job back in 2008 and I did it through 2013 in various capacities. And it seems to me that the same internal issues that I was seeing in the queer community then are the exact same issues that we're seeing now. And it is mind-boggling to me, and in a city as progressive as Seattle, that the queer community is so divided to the point where I'm almost does it even make sense to have all of these communities under one umbrella when their interests are so varied and so different. And like, people have this idea, well, all queer people must be after the same things. They're very much not. As we've learned
Not at all.
like, I have not seen this much vitriol between like the trans and gay community. I've never seen this much vitriol, and it goes both ways. And I'm just curious from your perspective, why has that only seemed to have gotten worse, this divisiveness in the queer community? And do you think that it does? Do you think it still makes sense to have all of these groups sort of quote unquote lumped together?
That's a very, very good question. I will say that I think the reason why it's more prevalent, the infighting within the queer community, is because we're more prevalent. We're not hiding anymore. We have social media on one side, helping us get our voices out there to the entire world, whether what we have to say is valuable or not. And we have platforms that did not used to exist. Billy Ray, you'll remember that drag didn't exist outside of the gay bars in Birmingham until Shout brought it downtown. And now there's drag brunches everywhere. And then there are elements of the arguments. There are points within the arguments that exist in the infighting in the queer community that I just feel like the straight community would laugh at. So the racial divides specifically. I know no one can compete with faith communities when it comes to the importance of diversity. That is not a priority for most LGBT individuals, particularly in the South, because on the one hand, we are LGBTQ individuals. We're queer identified, be it by our gender identity or our sexual identity. But we're also still just people, and we're here in the South. And so I honestly consider myself to be a little bit more provincial than most of my closest friends, even. We have conversations sometimes because we're close about things that I know we would never discuss out in the community for fear of acceptance or rejection. And so we have a chance to unpack with each other and really feel how diverse our community is. But a lot of folks aren't willing to have those conversations, not to mention they don't want to be seen as someone who subscribes to your ideals and morals just because you're both queer.
Yeah.
And that can exist for two gay men of the same age and race, because we're different. And so just like it affects, and oftentimes you will hear in the Black community, most recently and most popularly, when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock. The conversation the following morning among most of the Black community was, did your mother not teach you not to fight in front of white folks?
Yeah, I remember hearing a lot about that.
Right. Meanwhile, in other areas, I think immediately to the lesbian community, that this paints a really awful picture of racial, domestic violence, because it was a domestic issue. He felt the need to use violence to defend his significant other. And then are we going to allow for that? Because a lot of women thought, wow, wouldn't it be nice to have someone do that for me, to have someone love me that much? But that's bad. You don't want someone to love you that much. I say all that to say the arguments that we have within the queer community are very difficult for folks outside the queer community to understand because they don't walk in our shoes. And so I live in a lot of intersections, being Black American, being a woman, being from the South, being a Christian and a Democrat and queer. People don't even know what pansexual is for the most part down here. And so I have to, listen to the old church folks say one thing and then go into younger spaces and hear them say, I just don't know why it's so difficult for everyone to get my pronouns right. And I'm thinking, wow, I just got through talking to a man who doesn't understand the importance of a woman having a job, even, let alone, like diversity exists at different levels at different spaces. And it exists at such a high level within the LGBTQ community that a lot of us don't understand a lot of us like we think we do. And so we reject the idea of being, captured under one very broad brush, one umbrella. But I will say that, and I've been in LGBTQ services for 15 years, and I have consistently since day one heard a lot of complaints from predominantly the trans community saying that they don't want to be under this umbrella. Yeah. They don't fit underneath it. I know a lot of trans men who are straight and they don't identify with anything queer. Some of them are even Republicans, or were at least raised Republicans and have a lot of Republican views. And so the idea that they should be marching in the parade alongside people who live a little less conservative lifestyle, it's like totally offensive to them, and they don't understand really why it's necessary to be captured under that umbrella. But I say to them, and I say to you, the reason it's important is because it is one of the strongest and most diverse minority communities in the country, and we have to be collective in order to combat those against us. We can split up if we want. There are some folks in the Black community specifically that don't think this racial kumbaya should happen within the LGBTQ community. But if there's anything we learned from the civil rights movement, it's that building our allies and joining with people who are different from us but have a similar adversary can only do us good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And the reason for why we should, of course, make sense. And I am one of those people, too, that think, despite all of my frustrations, and there are many, I do think we are still stronger together than we are apart. And I think
For sure.
I get so frustrated because it's sort of like what you said. Like, we have so many real world issues that we need to be fighting together.
Right.
Why are we doing all of this petty infighting, which is all designed around like status in a weird way? Like I this will be my last comment, and then Erik, I want to bring you into the discussion. But I was having a conversation, and this was at a film festival several months ago, and there was a group of us standing around, and none of us really knew each other. We were just having sort of one of those post-screening discussions, and there was a trans person there, and they were having a conversation about how they felt that particularly white gay men, you've had enough time in charge of the queer community, thanks, but bye, we don't need you anymore. And it was very severe, and it was very like what a lot of white gay men are feeling right now, which is they're feeling like their place in the queer community is being erased. And there was an older white guy who was in there, very lovely, like older guy movie lover, and was very respectful in his response. But because the trans person who was talking, they were probably in their early 20s. And this gay white guy is in his late 50s, maybe even early 60s. And he was like very nice and was like, I respect where you're coming from, but like, you're not respecting the fact that you're saying that I don't have a place in this community that I am literally bathed in blood from. He was like, I spent 15 years of my life watching everybody around me die from AIDS, taking care of these people, burying these people, keeping their legacies alive. And you're telling me that I don't have a place in this community, which I put my blood, sweat, and tears into building up to where it is. And it was one of those conversations where the trans person, for better or worse, did not have a response to that. Because it's also just like,
how do you respond to that?
It's like, because it's like because there is no response, right? Because on one hand, he's absolutely right. And on the other hand, though, I also understand where the trans person's coming from to some degree. And I think there has to be this middle ground and this nuanced area where we all find a way to meet and still exist in the same community. Because I'll say this, and I don't mean this as a detriment to the trans community, but the trans community overall is still a very tiny percentage of the overall population, and not even the second or third biggest in the queer population. I'm not saying that doesn't entitle them a place at the table, or to have it entitles them to everything that the rest of the queer community is after. But I don't think it entitles them to just be kicking out other members of the community, because they're just not. They're not the driving force behind the community still. Not that they shouldn't be or won't be in 2 or 3 years, but the trans community is still a community. I mean, I think you'll even agree, back in the late 2010, like 9, 10, 11, 12, the trans community then was nothing close to what it is now.
Well, there's also not a lot of access to discovery or resources around.
Exactly.
You just discovering your own identity as trans, being affirmed as a trans individual. There are a lot of trans men who had never had any other guidance or help outside of being told they were lesbians.
Yeah.
And the same is true for a lot of trans women. And the trans community has led the gay community through a lot. For over the last 40 years alone, the conversation has been led by gay white men.
Yeah.
And the same anger and frustration that exists for the privilege that comes to anyone who's Caucasian and assigned male at birth in this country exists in the LGBTQ community. I, for one, I'm a little confused that we don't have more of our gay white male leaders taking a side and giving some of their space to, giving their platforms to other members of the LGBTQ community, particularly queer and trans people of color. But just like in every other space, as we go through this very difficult transition, as our boomers are aging and refusing to pass the baton in many different areas of change, I think it's a suffer. It's a struggle. I hate to yield to that. It's a struggle, but it really is. It's a struggle.
I would
think that we can come together, though.
I would ask too, and this is actually interesting. I want to, because I'm curious, because I agree with you. Like, and I certainly think, I don't think that white gay men should be leading the movement right now. I just don't think it's our time and our place right now. I think we should still be actively involved in the movement because let's be clear, we still overwhelmingly have the majority of wealth in the queer community. And we can have a whole conversation about how that's unfair, but it's still very much the truth in most areas. And I'm just curious, because to me, I see the gay community, it's more that they're on defensive than it is that I think they're against it, because I think when you're in a position when someone is coming at you, not from a position of, we respect everything that you've done for the fight, we respect everything that you've done for the movement, but maybe this isn't your time to lead it, versus what I see happening, which is like, and you've had your time, get out. And that's been my experience, at least on a micro level here in Seattle. And it's like, if you're coming at me as a white gay man and that is your approach, which is like, well, you've had your time, bye, Felicia, then I'm like, no, that's not okay. No. But if you come at me with that respect and but that said, respect's a two-way street, right? Like, you can't expect respect from a community if you're not willing to give it to that community in return. And so I get so jaded because I just don't know where the queer community is headed. And the fights just seem to be getting more and more heated, and like everybody seems miserable. And it's like, we're the queer community. We should be we should be fighting and being serious about what we're fighting for, but we should also be able to we're queer. We're fabulous creatures. We should be able to express that fabulous and have fun and do all of these things. And we're spending so much time on what separates us and not enough time on what connects us together.
Well, you know what's separating? So first off, I'm not being gay. Excuse me. I think that even speaking about this is fraught, but I want to be fair and clear. And my introduction to the gay community was as a child. My mom knew a lot of gay men. My mom was part of a community of women who had a lot of gay friends, and that's how I was introduced to the gay community when I was a child. Also, my mom was friends with a lot of second wave feminists, so I was introduced to that community as well, which is the lesbian community as a child. And one of the things that Gina said earlier, when you discussed, sorry, she, like you're a third person or something, when you discussed the political diversity of the gay community, I think that's part of this mess is that, it's funny, Gina, you said similar adversary. I'm going to say that you had a similar assailant in the past. But what's happened is there's a large portion of the gay community that has gained what they wanted to gain. They have the rights to marriage. They have the rights to take in foster children or even adopt. They've gotten what they want. They're no longer being assailed. They're no longer under attack. So you're now seeing a community that is very assailed, and that's the transgender community. Yes. And to be clear, I'm not going to let the transgender community off, because there are those within the thought space, the people that are creating the concepts that many transgender people are espousing, which actually state that homosexuality is going to go away. that there will be no homosexual people anymore.
Right.
And I think that for obviously the huge gender critical community in the lesbian community, which is growing day by day, they're offended by that. And I think that there are gay men that are offended by that as well. That just because I enjoy feminizing things or things that are maybe not stereotypically or classically male things, but a good example would be, I liked dolls when I was a kid, and many of my mom's gay friends had doll houses, and so I would go play with dolls, right? But that didn't mean that I was gay or trans, nor did it mean that, right? But what it did, what you get now is you'll see this mess in that space, right? Of how do you tell for instance, how do you tell a child is trans? Well, if they're doing these things in the past, that wasn't considered a transgendered behavior. So all of that mess now is, I think, coming to roost. And I think a lot of the resistance you see with older, not necessarily conservative, but absolutely conservative gay people, but also middle of the road and only slightly liberal gay people who are no longer assailed, is like, oh, wait, I'm not getting into this mess. And so I think that without dealing with that now I think maybe is even a crisis of diversity, not saying that diversity is a crisis, but you get my point. There's lots of different ideas here.
Yeah.
And until people who are transgendered and people who are politically queer versus just being gay, okay? Until everybody can find common ground again, and in this case, since they don't have a common assailant anymore, you're seeing, I think, that's where some of this sundering or this tearing apart is happening, because there are some gay people, especially conservative gay people, who now have all the rights they want. They're like, to go be crazy somewhere else. That's the attitude they have.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, no, I agree with that too. Yeah. That's right on. Yeah.
And they're certainly trying to draw the line between what is lewd and inappropriate for children.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes the attacks on the trans community the most dangerous, right? There are still a lot of people, even within the lesbian, gay, and bisexual communities, that don't understand the difference between a drag queen and a trans woman. Cis women have been doing drag for years, and no one has had a difficult time drawing the difference between a man and a woman performing in drag. But as someone close to a lot of trans women, and as someone raised by drag queens, I can tell you that argument begins between those two populations before it even enters the rest of the queer community. And so no one's really able to lead or offer any explanation that seems to work for a lot of folks. And so to your point, Erik, a lot of people think, well, why am I fighting this fight? That has nothing to do with me.
I'm sorry. One of the things I just want to add to that real quick, there's also a difference between drag queens and strippers. And that's the mess that's being made, right? There's people making that into a mess. So keep going. Sorry about that.
Yes. No, yeah, it definitely is. And we're trying to draw those differences for folks that already have a difficult enough time accepting us being residents of their state and being constituents in their district to begin with. But there is a huge, and the first thing that folks started to say when they introduced two of these mini bills is what makes the difference between a drag show, taking your children to a drag show, and taking your children to Hooters, or Twin Peaks. Right. How is it different? And I have seen some very interesting things in drag shows before. Things can get really campy, really avant-garde, and sometimes macabre.
Yeah.
But you have to pay for that, and there are no children present.
Right. Yeah.
And having a Disney princess, read your child a story at Disney World is no different than having a drag queen read your child a fairy tale story in a library, a local public library. And there's no denying that. Anyone that can draw a stark difference, I challenge them to explain it and share it with us. They really can't. And that's why we are thinking and hoping that these bills won't go very far.
Yeah.
Because you can't really sign into law and act, you can't enforce. It's impossible. And there's no way to enforce that unless they shut down all the Hooters and Twin Peaks and restaurants like them. And honestly, ballroom dancing and a lot of the other forms of entertainment, theater, the list goes on and on. that they would then have to re-examine if they wanted to take away drag in our country.
Well, most of these laws that are being passed, like I just read that DeSantis had signed this bill in Florida that allows doctors to not treat trans people if they choose not to for religious beliefs. Like, there's no way that's not going to, I mean, that's going to get shot down, even if it has to go all the way to the Supreme Court. Yes, I know the Supreme Court leads conservative. It'll still get shot down. Like, those types of laws are going to eventually get overturned. It's ridiculous that anybody has to even put up with them until then, but they're going to get overturned.
Meanwhile, we're fighting over our budgets and, keeping our economy afloat and gun control, among the many things. There's so many other issues to focus on rather than focusing on one that does absolutely nobody any good. And our tax dollars are paying for these fights to be had in our respective capitals. And it's just such a waste of time. That's the thing that's most difficult for me to swallow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could talk for another 4 hours, Gina, but unfortunately we can't. But I think we're definitely both going to have you back on the show at some point, because I just enjoy chatting with you. And
awesome.
Talk to us a little bit. So, how can people, if people want to get involved and support the Memorial Project, how can people do that?
Yeah. Well, we're Jefferson County Memorial Project.com. We are a nonprofit. We exist as under the fiscal sponsorship of Greater Birmingham Ministries, which has been around and a part of the Poor People's Project since Birmingham was referred to as the Johannesburg of the South and Birmingham. Oof. And so if folks want to support us, the easiest way and the most magnificent way would be to purchase an engraved brick at our memorial. And so that exists along a stretch, a path within the memorial where folks will be able to sit and reflect on where we go from here. And we think that one of the most fitting ways to inspire such change is by reading the names of and learning the histories of folks who have brought us to where we are today. And so those are the names that will be inscribed on those bricks, and folks can purchase a brick dedication through our website, jeffersoncountymemorial.com.
Gina, thank you so much for being on the show. I mean,
thank you. It was awesome.
Always have such a blast chatting with you, and I look forward to having you back on at some point.
Thank you. It has been so great to catch up with you, Billy Ray, and we miss you so much here in Birmingham. Erik, it's been a delight getting to know you, and I do hope for more conversations.
Absolutely.
In the future.
Thanks, Gina. Wow. So that was a conversation. Gina is remarkable. I've known Gina for a number of years, and I've just always enjoyed any conversation I've ever had with her, whether it was political or otherwise. And I have so much respect for her, just in the extent of she is a Black queer woman, like navigating a very successful space for herself in Alabama, of all places, and doing really important work there in a number of different ways. And so, I just super inspired by Gina every time. So it's
her viewpoints and her expression were honestly refreshing to me, because I have a bias sometimes against far left people, and she's pretty left and very much so, and had nothing but cogent, important, real shit to say, authentic shit that, in fact, I'm glad that you asked her back, because I can't wait to speak with her again. I really think that this is the essence of the podcast. That discussion, that conversation is the essence of me being, because I think that, you know what I mean? The left and the right like to nut pick. They pick a nutty person on the right if you're on the left, and vice versa. Gina's not a nut. She's a real person doing real work that's going to make a real difference for years to come. Why wouldn't you want that? And even coming from, if you were to come from the right, I'm trying to look at it from a right lens. She has things to say that people on the right can hear. That's important.
And these are the types of folks I want on this podcast. I want the grassroots folks. I want the folks who are down on the ground on like that organizational community level, because frankly, I think they have the most insight to impart. Like, you see the same pundits and the same political voices recycling the same old talking points. And these are generally people who are not in the thick of it. They are either legislating or they're working from this perch, and they don't have any toe stepped in community at all. And I think
they're not aside from some aside from some statement, they don't have any skin in the game, and Gina is absolutely all skin in the game.
Absolutely. And
Right.
so super hope you enjoyed that conversation. We'll definitely have Gina back on. I think Gina's going to be one of this rotating roster of folks that we have on whenever we want to, go deep on a specific issue. And because I think Gina is qualified to talk about so many of them. So next week, we have on our guest who we told you falsely last week was going to be on this week's
I know.
episode.
Now for real.
That was all me.
Now for real.
Yeah, not for real. But our guest next week is a senior scientist, professor, and geriatric medicine specialist at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and the author of the Accidental Plague Diaries and the Accidental Plague Diaries Volume 2, Dr. Andrew Duxbury. And I know what you're thinking. Is every guest going to be from Alabama? The answer is no. I just happen to have a lot of
just for now.
Yeah, I just had a lot of really fascinating, interesting folks that I knew from Alabama that I was like, I want to get them on the podcast. And I thought a lot of the issues that we're talking about sort of on a societal level these days are issues that they can all speak to. And so we're absolutely going to be bringing non-Alabama voices into the mix. But I do think it's important for folks to hear from people that they may have preconceived notions about because they are from certain areas in this country that have a reputation that, is or is not warranted. And so I like people knowing that we're not all right-wing nut jobs in Alabama. There are a lot of amazing progressive people who are fighting for change and fighting for, rights for everybody there.
Right.
And
it's not a monoculture. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, you just don't hear about those voices. And they're not the ones doing the stupid shit like Tommy Tuberville or people like that. Like they're the people actually, making the change and on the ground doing stuff. So I'm super excited to talk to Andy about really COVID. It's really going to be a very COVID-focused conversation, I think, about sort of, what went right, what went wrong in the pandemic, what his life on the ground was as a working physician was, and sort of like, how do we see that COVID has changed us for better and worse moving forward?
Right.
And there are a lot of conversations to be had around that. So I think, and I am almost, I had already read Accidental Plague Diaries. I had not read the sequel. So I'm halfway through Accidental Plague Diaries 2. And so we're going to be very informed for that conversation, which is really exciting. So I hope you'll stick around next week and enjoy that. The Center Clueless podcast is produced by Ryan Verrill. You can visit us at centerclueless.com for more information or find us on the socials at Center Clueless. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends to tune in. Also, if video is more your thing and you would rather watch us rather than hear us, you can do so on our YouTube channel where all of our episodes will be uploaded there. Please smash and subscribe. That's what the kids say these days. So I figured, why not do that as well? If you have a question, comment, or criticism, email us at centerclueless.com. Jesus Christ. Centerclueless@gmail.com.
Right. By the way, I want to add to that. I really want to hear from you if you disagree. I really want to hear from you if we missed something. And I have no problems not only reading your email, how about we even have you come on and talk with us about it?
Absolutely.
I'd love to do that. I'd love to talk with you because that's exactly what this is about, is the expansion of the discourse around anything that we're discussing. And again, it's important for us to hear you, and I'd love for you to join in.
Well, and I'll make a specific plea as well, because we talk about this show about inviting all voices to the table, and I mean that, and we both mean that. If you are out there and you are someone who identifies as MAGA or far-right Republican, I do want to hear from you. Especially if you're someone who thinks that you have a unique take that you don't hear anybody else in your circles sort of. I want to hear from you. I want to know what that take is. I want to have an honest conversation with you. It's not an ambush. It's not designed to make you look foolish at all. Any way you come across is going to be based solely on what you say and how you say it. And it's not going to be spun in any way, shape, or form. So if you want to come on here, we invite you to come on. We want to have those tough conversations. Doesn't mean we're going to agree on most things, but maybe we can at least come around on one issue.
Right. And I want to say that you have a right to be heard. Just because you're a MAGA Republican doesn't mean that you should be silenced, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have your thoughts expressed. You have a right as an American to be heard. Please exercise that right here. I would love to do that, and I would love to have a discussion with you and go back and forth, and maybe come to some common ground even.
Yeah, absolutely. Until next time, which will be 1 week from now. So stick around. You'll get your fix soon enough. Whether you're left, right, or somewhere in the center, we hope you are a little less clueless, just like us. Bye, everybody.